If you have ever previously worked for a client or have done any freelance or any type of design work for someone, you probably at some point have encountered this type of feedback. It is great, but can you make it pop? Or something along those lines. This type of feedback is extremely common. And in this video, I'd like to go over why I think that's the case and also how to properly deal with such feedback. So again, if you have ever gotten this type of feedback, you might have asked yourself, what does that even mean? And that's a very good question because this is very generic and there isn't anything of substance in this type of feedback, to be honest, right? Let's make it completely clear. But after all, your client is your client and you want to make them happy, right? You might have asked yourself, so are they right? How do you add such a pop? What does this mean? First of all, the client is not always right. But what I think is almost certain is that the client is trying to articulate their emotional response to your designs, right? So they see what you have created for them and they might feel something. They might have some kind of opinion about it, but they lack the vocabulary and sufficient experience to be actually able to articulate their emotions, articulate their opinion, and therefore they are simply unable to provide you with any more concrete feedback. Because after all, they are not art directors, they are just clients, somebody who hired you as a design specialist, and it would be a bit unfair to expect of them they will be able to come up with highly specific feedback. So it's very important to recognize what this actually means. This means they are trying to articulate what they think about your design, but they are simply unable to do so. So it is up to you to translate this into the designer's language or whatever you might consider, for example, some kind of instructions, specific instructions for you to deal with, and offer potential solutions. So that's what you need to do, right? As I said, let's not forget that in this type of interaction, you are usually the expert and you should be able to come up with these solutions and actually recognize what's happening, right? Now, this doesn't always mean that whenever you get such a feedback that it's warranted. Sometimes this type of feedback is simply a bad feedback. It is simply insufficient. But in these types of situations, first of all, you can absolutely ask more questions, right? You might ask the client to specify what they mean by this, or even talk to your superiors or your peers, or maybe Google online, or ask them to provide some examples. So I want to make it clear that it is not always your responsibility to bring a solution or to always be the one with all the answers. Sometimes the clients simply suck, but usually, from my experience, usually the clients are just simply trying to articulate their opinion while also being not really equipped to do so. So this means there are no universal solutions for this. So when a client tells you that they want to make it pop, there are no certain ways and rules you can apply and simply make this feeling go away. With design, with creative industries, with creative professions, it's always highly subjective and each situation is usually extremely unique. With that being said, however, here are some tips on how to deal with this. What direction should you take your design in? What you might do and what might be the causes of such feedback. In some cases, in a lot of cases actually, when someone says, can you make it pop? They simply mean, can you make the elements or can you make the design overall more contrasting, right? So let's say that you have these colors in your design. And with this first tip, making it pop would mean simply increasing the contrast, which means making the darker color even darker and the lighter color even lighter, right? So that might be one solution that you might actually try and do to increase the contrast. You know, after all, if you place these on top of each other, this simply pops more than the previous version, right? Insufficient contrast might be one of the causes. Then you do not lead the viewer's eye. Now, what does this mean? Again, some kind of new phrase, but simply put, this means that you haven't established a sufficient visual hierarchy for your design. So this means that your design, simply when people look at your design, they do not know where to look first and they do not know where to look second and third and so on, right? So ideally, in an ideal case, you want to create a design where it's absolutely completely clear what you should focus on first and what you should focus on second, right? For example, On websites, you have something called H1 and H2 and so on. And each step lower in this hierarchy of headlines, the font becomes smaller all the way down to the paragraph text. Why is this the case? This is the case because people simply notice the most prominent, the biggest things first, and using these headlines simply is using that to your advantage, right? So if there's some kind of generic piece of information, let's say this is going to be generic information, whereas headline 3 is going to be very specific information. Why? Because there is usually going to be a lot more specific information than generic information. By definition, specific information usually are going to take up more space, which means they need to be smaller in order to fit on a screen, right? So that's one of the cases of leading the eye. This doesn't happen just with headlines, but also with objects, right? So if you have a huge rectangle, you have this rectangle, then you have a smaller one, right? Then you have a rectangle that is lighter in color, and then you have one that is lighter but also even smaller, right? So here, for example, it's absolutely clear what's happening here is that you want the user to first take a look here and then notice the remaining squares, the remaining rectangles. I'm using contrast as well as size to lead the eye. So that's something that perhaps your client might be looking for, right? They're looking for guidance for their perception. Where should they look first, second, and third? What's the most important piece of information, right? So that might be that's the second tip. You should lead the eye of the user and of your audience. Now the third tip is the design lacks depth. And by depth, I mean visual depth, right? And of course, it's going to be an illusion of depth. You can't really put a 3D space on a flat screen, right? This is very easy when you are, for example, I don't know, an interior designer or an architect. I mean, adding depth to your design is very easy because, well, you have the 3D space. But as a designer, usually, as a digital designer, at least that's my case, you have just 2D tools to achieve this result. Or you can do some kind of 3D renders, but let's assume that we are just using 2D tools. You could, for example, take an object and add a shadow. So immediately, as you can see right here, so immediately after I added a shadow, you can see that the square is literally, we made the square pop, right? So that's how you can, for example, add depth. And then the final tip is target audience misalignment. Now, these are just very fancy words for saying that your client thinks that their target audience, right, people that will be actually using or looking at your designs, will consider your design to be boring. This doesn't mean your design actually is boring, right? Let's consider these two cases. Let's do this. Let's consider these two cases. Imagine an ad for a car for men in their 50s, right? Imagine such a commercial for a car. And now I want you to think about a clothing brand for teenagers. Now let me ask you these questions. From these two audiences, which one do you think is going to respond more to plain minimalist design? Which one is going to respond to colorful and vibrant fonts? Right? Which target audience is going to perceive slang more favorably? Is it going to be men in their 50s or teenagers? Of course, we are talking about stuff in general, right? So there are, of course, men in their 50s who enjoy colorful and vibrant colors or fonts. But if you are designing for averages, right? Designing for as many people as possible, usually it's the case that I would associate colorful and vibrant fonts and slang with teenagers and plain and minimalist design with men in their 50s, right? So if your client is designing for group number 1, or actually for group number 2, and you provide them with a design best suited for someone in their 50s, then your client might look at your design and say, well, this is just simply too boring. We need to make it pop. Right? We need to make it pop. And we are back at square one. So this doesn't mean that your design is actually bad or boring, but it simply means that you are maybe designing for somebody else, or that your designs might be better suited for somebody else than you think it will, if that makes sense. So these are the 4 tips on how to actually make your designs pop. Now let's actually take these tips and actually try and put them to use. So here we have 2 frames. What you can see here is they both have this phrase. It's great, but can you make it pop? And we are going to try and make this pop, right? So let's use these 4 tips. So insufficient contrast. As you can see, we have light gray and white, which are different colors, but they are not the most different colors that exist, right? So let's, as a first step, let's try adding this to an auto layout, making the background actually black and making the font white. Now that's definitely more contrast. Then you do not lead the eye. Well, right now we already provided what I think is, it's actually very clear what you should focus on. But let's, for example, split this into multiple lines. It's great, but can you make it pop? Let's actually do this all caps, make this bold and larger, and let's decrease the line height of this and also write this in all caps. Increase the size, increase the font weight, and also the color maybe here as well. So what I did here is I differentiated visually these things to make sure that some are more prominent than the others. So right now, as you can see, what you should definitely be focusing on first is the word pop, or at least that's what I'm trying to make you do, right? I'm trying to make you notice this word first, then this, and then the rest, which overall adds up to this phrase. And then let's add some padding, actually around the corners, and let's add a shadow, effects, drop shadow, add blur, and let's even perhaps add something into the background, a black color with a gradient. And the reason I'm doing this is to basically add depth, right? So if I create some kind of, or at least a simulation of a 3D space, right, you can immediately see how it's starting to look as if there are multiple objects in this layout. We have some kind of object in the background and so on. So that's how we added depth. We lead the eye, and then let's actually work on the last point, target audience misalignment. And let's consider that this is great for, these colors are great for, you know, maybe more for somebody in their 50s. If we wanted to make this more vibrant, we want to maybe change the colors, make some gradients, for example. Maybe the shadow is going to be actually the color of the object and not black. And then these things in the background, they are also going to be rather colorful, right? So we added some color. So now if your client tells you it's great, but can you make it pop? Maybe try adding contrast, try adding visual hierarchy, try adding some depth, and maybe think about who you are actually designing for. So I hope this video helped you. Of course, each situation is unique. Everybody has different tastes, and I cannot provide you with absolutely 100% of the time effective tips for this feedback, but usually, from my experience at least, it's been one of those 4 things. So thanks for tuning in. Leave a like if this video helped you. Leave a comment if you have anything to add, if you maybe have a tip from your experience how to deal with such a feedback. I'll be happy to learn about your experience and learn something new. And I will see you in the next one.